This is the Kratom Science Journal Club with Dr. Jonathan Cachat, neuroscientist and expert in psychopharmacology. In each episode, we discuss an article in a peer-reviewed journal. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for KratomScience.com, your source for all things Kratom. Embarrassingly poor evidence and data, and a failure to consider overall public health. That's what a former Secretary of Health called the FDA's justification for seeking a Kratom ban. We'll look at it through Jane Babin's report called FDA Fails to Follow the Science on Kratom. Had fun at Kratom Panic 2021 for the past few days.
Yeah, you're going to have to bring me up to speed on that. I don't know, the intricate details of what's been happening recently, but I'm interested to hear.
So the FDA released a press release that they seized something like 37,000 kilos of Kratom from Fort Myers, Florida. They're calling it like a new dietary ingredient that's not approved, and they're calling the Kratom itself an adulterant in a dietary supplement, and they get the U.S. Marshals to go down. And then I think it was Dr. Woodcock was her name, and Scott Gottlieb on Friday night had coordinated tweets against Kratom and about this seizure. Kind of makes it look like illegal, and it's justified on a 2012 import alert. They started it that year, that import alert for Kratom, which
gotcha.
I guess.
Hold on one sec. So recently, there was a big seizure that happened down in Florida.
Yeah,
and then recently, we had a tweet by is Gottlieb current FDA director?
No, he's now on the board of Pfizer. The current guy's name is Steve Hahn. He was kind of like the interim director after Gottlieb, and I guess Biden didn't appoint anyone. I don't know if he does that, but there's a new HHS person, Rachel Levine, who is from Pennsylvania, but yeah, no, Gottlieb is on the board of Pfizer now, and he still wants to ban Kratom for reasons that might be revealed in this document we're going to look at.
So that was all recent, and so it continues. So what else is going on? Or are we going back to 2012?
Well, no, that's when they first issued the import alert, and at least, people have told me 2015 they started doing this seizure press release thing. So it seemed like there has been about one a year since 2015. There wasn't any last year because they were busy with COVID, but I looked at a press release from 2016. It is almost word for word, and it's funny, they do it. It's like a form article, because there's an opening paragraph, then there's a quote from somebody on the second paragraph, then there's a couple of paragraphs that were exact, pretty much word for word from the 2016 one. So they do this every year, and then there's a panic in the Kratom community. Everybody thinks, the cops are going to bust down their door tomorrow and take their Kratom, which is impossible unless you're in one of those illegal states, because the local state police don't have the power to come seize your Kratom because it's not illegal. There's just that import alert that apparently gives the FDA the power to seize some shipments.
Yeah, seized in Florida. Was it a large wholesale, a couple kilos or a couple pounds? Or
was it was 37,000 kilos. So it was probably a shipload, or a couple of whatever those tractor trailer things that they carry over on cargo ships.
Boat.
37,000 kilos. It seems like a lot, but I've heard the supplier that actually, anybody shipping that much in is obviously pretty big in the game, and somebody told me he's going to be back at it in 3 weeks. So these things essentially mean nothing, and they're mostly like a show business type thing. It makes Kratom seem illegal to the public who's unaware. They're like, oh, they're seizing this stuff. I saw that in my local store. I'm going to go complain. And, it's kind of tries to turn the public against it to make it by making it seem like an illegal drug. But they have the legal power to do this. They just don't have. I don't think they have the resources to seize all the shipments constantly, because like the U.S. Marshals are carrying out the enforcement. That I looked them up. There's about 4,000 total U.S. Marshals in the whole country. They have other shit to do, and I don't know. Maybe they could start doing this on the weekly, but over the past 6 years at least, or just 6 years, they've been doing this once a year. It's always the same press release. There's always a panic.
So it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting. We're sort of like, at that time of year again, COVID subsided. Now we need to justify our existence and let's go after Kratom again.
Yeah.
I think that most people in the Kratom community understand that the FDA and other sort of regulatory bodies are going after Kratom in a way where it's like kind of shady, if not fraudulent, right?
Yeah.
But this paper that we are going over today about the FDA and so what's the title here? FDA fails to follow the science on Kratom. This was written in 2018 by Jane Babin, who I was pleased to see has a PhD in molecular biology. So we got that covered, and also a JD. So, if it's hard to get someone more qualified to write something about how regulatory bodies are approaching the science.
And if she happens to hear this, come on the show. I tried to message her, I think, on LinkedIn and get in touch, but she's probably a busy lady. So.
Well, yeah, it would be great if we could have you on for sure. And I think, just my quick summary, and then we can go, we can follow the whatever outline that you wanted to. But this article very clearly lays out, like, year after year after year, repeated instances where falsified data or incomplete data is continually used and not even acknowledged. Like, before I read this, I was like, I knew that the FDA was being shady. I knew that they were using, shoddy data to justify what they were going after. But I thought it was sort of like one time, two times, like then sort of get around to it. But this is like a well-documented specific history of repeatedly using incomplete, incorrect, or falsified data since 2012. And it just sort of blew my mind seeing that all laid out in one article.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. And I read it shortly after it came out, which was August 2018, which was ironically, I don't know if there is a connection, but it's the same month the Human Health and Human Services Director, Brett Giroir, sent the letter to the DEA rescinding the HHS ban recommendation on Kratom. That letter was only discovered in, I think January this year that it existed. Wow. I don't know why he kept it quiet, or the guy that received the DEA letter kept it quiet. I don't know if it was some kind of political deal with Scott Gottlieb, who was at the time the FDA director. But yeah, so this came out that same month, and he it's probably because he read this and then did the rescinded the recommendation for the ban, which is also the HHS's current stance on it now. There's a new director, Rachel Levine, but the HHS needs to recommend to the DEA that Kratom should be scheduled first, and then there's a process, so they can't just make Kratom illegal tomorrow. And some people don't seem to understand that, because it seems like they're panicking, and a lot of people, it sucks because a lot of people out there got like some PTSD, bad anxiety. That's the reason they might be discovered Kratom in the first place. So it's kind of shitty to see a panic happen. It might serve their purposes or something. It's just and given what's in this document, they're not innocently overlooking information here. It's pretty repeated and sustained. Here, I'll just read from Jane Babin's article here. The burden is on the FDA to demonstrate through credible evidence that uncontaminated and unadulterated whole leaf kratom is a dangerous substance, a claim currently made without scientific integrity. So they have to they have to provide an I think an 8-factor analysis to justify that it's a dangerous drug. And so this is a legal process but it's clearly their justification as outlined in this article is clearly lacking.
I think, of course, we can talk about the 44 deaths that are reported. I'd like to talk about their database because I was just browsing it myself, the public dashboard. The continued reliance on it. And so let's just talk about the database real quick. The database is the FDA Adverse Events Reporting System. It's kind of like FEARS if you're dyslexic.
FEARS or FAIRS.
Or FAIRS.
FEARS.
So this is a public dashboard where essentially FDA employees are supposed to work with pharmaceutical companies and research organizations. They work with poison control centers, et cetera, and case studies. And they essentially list in any adverse events that are reported on the drugs. And so, it's very clearly laid out in her article that some of these cases are duplicated. There's poor documentations reporting back to the original study. There's material omissions, so like where they came from, what country they came from. So it's difficult to have a fair review of that information. And they also, and I think this is probably the one that people in the Kratom community know about, but like a lot of times they will leave out what the coroner or medical examiner or other healthcare professionals actually listed or determined was the cause of death, in some ways making it seem like Kratom was the only thing in their system and that the Kratom was deadly. And I think, that's so there's plenty to jump into there, but you got to remember, like, the FDA's role is to sort of protect public safety from anything that could be dangerous for public health. And that's what they've been trying to do and repeatedly trying to do with Kratom. And this article sort of lays out why it just seems like if they're not doing this intentionally, then what are they doing? Because it's very sloppy.
It's kind of sloppy in a consistent way. I was just going to go through her bullet points of what they omitted. Omissions of data from source documents, omissions of references to peer source data authored by science and analysts that were reported to the FDA and contradicts the FDA claim that Kratom is directly associated with the deaths. Omission of the cause of deaths conclusions by scientists, medical examiners, healthcare professionals. And I think like one of the first ones they go through is like a duplication on two of the same deaths at least that they found, and she said there was probably more duplications included. So when you look at the news and you see Kratom caused 91 deaths, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at the first 44. They since upped it to 91, and this is the kind of stuff they're doing here.
There's two things. One thing I just found out about what the FDA sort of disclaims about this database. But I think we need to just make sure to establish first that they enter this information into the database, the FDA does. And then in the case with Kratom, they repeatedly refer to this database as the source of information to say that 44 people have died with Kratom. Now it's up. It looks like death cases. I just put in mitragynine in the public dashboard. It says 399 cases at this point. Okay. It's interesting. Like, I wonder if alcohol is in here. Let's see what alcohol says. Alcohol is 17,000 deaths, which seems to me to be low.
Really.
So they enter it into this database and they use the information in this database to make policy recommendations. It started in 2012 with the import alert, then 2014, 2016, public health advisory in 2017. And I like how she mentions and describes the fact that the FDA has this huge regulatory network. So they work with the DEA, they work with the CDC, they work with National Institutes of Drug Abuse, and they work with local and state law enforcement officers. And so they enter the information in this database, they use it to justify their policy recommendations. And this article very clearly lays out several sort of problems with the database. Now, interestingly, if you go to this FDA website and go to launch their public dashboard, below the button to get to the public dashboard, they say, while the dashboard offers stakeholders many ways for looking at it, they say they're basically disclaiming it. So there are limitations to our data. The FARS contains reports of a particular drug or biologic. That does not mean the drug or biologic caused an adverse event. Importantly, the FARS data by themselves are not an indicator of the safety profile of the drug or the biologic. Some additional limitations include duplicate and incomplete reports in the system, existence of reports that did not establish causation, information in reports that has not been verified, rates of occurrence cannot be established with these reports. And so I was sort of shocked to see that. I mean, they're basically acknowledging everything that this woman's writing about and that it's across the board for almost all the drugs they have in there. Yet they repeatedly refer to this dashboard or database as the source of information for why they're making policy recommendations. And I don't get that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're just paying attention to this one thing. I mean, I can't imagine all the other stuff that didn't have any advocacy efforts and interest behind it that this same sort of thing happened with.
Yeah. It's just, it's like, I can just imagine if you were to bring this to the FDA and say, look, there's duplicates, it's incomplete, you're doing it, what do they go? Well, look, we just had interns in for the summer and had them do it. And we tell you right in the front page that you're not supposed to use this data for reports. And like they would stop there and not admit that they're using the data for policy recommendations. But it just, I don't know, it's frustrating sometimes the way these regulators work, where they're really going out of their way to rationalize something in a logical manner that it very quickly makes it seem like there's other reasons why you're trying to get X compound prohibited. It's not because it's actually dangerous, because you acknowledge that the information you're using to suggest that it's dangerous isn't solid information. So I don't know how we can come to any other conclusion other than like there's something else going on here.
Yeah. If you really wanted to find out about it, you certainly wouldn't include. I mean, we can go through all the. I think it would probably be helpful to go through, but the one guy got shot.
Right.
And actually, Nick Wing from Huffington Post discovered that. So that was pretty crazy. Like you said, there's duplications. They listed at least one or two that were duplicated, and everybody should read this whole thing because, and especially if you're interested in the Kratom thing, because it was the one thing that solidified in my mind that this is there's a political push to. They're not just innocently trying to protect public health as they claim.
And especially if you're involved in advocacy at any, locally, statewide in your community, you want to, when you go talk to a policymaker and they're like, well, the FDA is claiming deaths that are associated with Kratom, you want to be able to point out to them that all of the very specifics in here, you want to be knowledgeable to be able to go back and forth, because otherwise, you're essentially going to get the DC dip and twirl, and they're going to make some, illogical claim without any evidence, and then you're sort of stuck. So I would echo that. I do think for anybody that's in the Kratom advocacy realm, this is a really important paper for you to understand, because you're going to have to use it when you're talking to policymakers.
Yeah. Let's take the Krypton thing. Krypton, there was 9 people who died in that product they were taking. This was in Sweden. There was Kratom, but there was also O-desmethyltramadol. And at levels for all of them were toxic enough to kill them alone. For 7 of them that they had toxicology for, I think it said the mitragynine was like very low, not even close to anything that would ever be considered toxic, even if we know that yet, because it's been pretty hard for scientists to kill rats with mitragynine. The O-desmethyltramadol, most people recognize tramadol as a synthetic opiate used for prescribed for pain management.
It's not necessarily, it's sort of a step, it's kind of like codeine and tramadol are about the same level of, strength. Then you get to the hydrocodone and the oxycodone. But I just wanted to point out, and this may seem a little nitpicky, but it's important. So in the database, they entered the information as suspected product active ingredients, and they replaced the O-decimethyltramadol with just tramadol hydrochloride, the one that's actually being prescribed. And so if you're in the business of making policy recommendations based on the science, especially like adverse events between drug interactions and contra interactions between different drugs, it's important to know which drug you're actually talking about. And so while it seems nitpicky, and it seems like maybe it was that summer intern who just put in tramadol and then clicked the first one in the autocomplete field, this information has to be accurate if you want to actually make recommendations off of it, because it matters.
Yeah, and so they're looking. So Babin's looking at the original reports and comparing it with the FDA database. So in with the Krypton, she said the original report number 8083892 submitted by Shearing Plow states unequivocally on page 6 no tramadol in the blood. Right. Yeah, so we're talking about O-desmethyltramadol, which was what probably killed the 9 people. But why would they replace it with tramadol? Is that maybe a weaker substance?
No, I think honestly, I think it was someone typing in an auto-completed field and selecting the first one. Someone who was younger and wasn't necessarily looking at it. It wasn't a psychopharmacologist or a pharmacologist who would want the very specific information. They're correct. So I don't know why. I like the paragraph right after this. First of all, it's important to note that this was a contaminated kratom product with something in it that wasn't kratom. So kratom has not been established as dangerous here. Contaminated products have been established as dangerous, which is something everybody acknowledges and everyone would like to get regulated properly. So there's that. But then secondly, after that, they go, the failure to recognize scientifically documented cases of these deaths served to materially mislead the CDA and NIDA in the publication and all of the respective alerts that allege kratom-caused deaths because this information is incorrect. And in these letters to all of these agencies and these policy recommendations, the paragraph right below that says, the FARS database was the only source of information from the FDA on many of the alleged kratom-associated deaths. So they acknowledge on the front page of this database that you cannot make causal like associations. And just because something's listed in here doesn't mean that it actually was what caused his death. Yet, very clearly, it's the only source of information that they're handing over to say, hey, kratom is associated with people dying. It's not the case.
Yeah, and even in the database, they don't cite the original report, which is just, I do that on my blog. That's just... I was going to say, yeah, for sure. It's a higher
like
any a freshman college student has to cite the report, or they're going to get, they're going to get points removed on their paper. The other one, and what's more, the FDA and the DEA, when they tried to schedule it in 2016, were using these deaths as an example. They were citing, and then when it goes out in the media, you figure, oh yeah, well, these guys know what they're talking about, and a lot of the journalists writing about it don't look into it at all, which there's no excuse for. It kind of starting to piss me off, because it's like, I know it doesn't take that long to just look something up and at least present another side. So there was more exclusion of toxic drugs. There was a drug U47700 called Pink, which is toxic. And she says it's impossible to determine if this omission was made deliberately to make it more difficult to recognize the duplication report of 1449343, or if the purpose was to remove the reference to the substance deemed to be the primary cause of death to enhance the role of kratom in the death.
Yeah, she does call it out and says it's highly unlikely that these errors were omissions and merely inadvertent typos. And I think, I guess I was just trying to suggest that the tramadol versus the O-decimethyl tramadol was a typo. I think she's right, though, when you look at the totality of the errors that have occurred, like repeatedly. It's not necessarily just one situation, like you've been saying.
There was a married couple that took loperamide or loperamide. The reference to the journal article was obscured by citing authors' first names, Sandra, Mark, and Jennifer, instead of their last names in the FAERS database. That one was funny.
Gosh. Yeah, gosh. And you're exactly right to call out to say, like, look, a freshman at undergrad or even in high school that's writing any sort of biology paper will get a failing grade if they don't properly cite their sources. Yet somehow our government's sort of premier body on collecting the scientific data related to certain compounds or biological compounds fails this very low baseline requirement for any sort of data, aggregation. It's silly.
She also said the FDA has an army of scientists, investigators, analysts, lab technicians who are fully capable of conducting a rigorous scientific review of each of the alleged deaths associated with Kratom. And they're just not doing that. So it's crazy. Okay, so another one was a suicide. A suicide with no Kratom association. It was intentional abuse of acetaminophen, with the report only noting the possible consumption of both alcohol and Kratom. So somebody ate a bottle of Tylenol.
Ate a bottle of Tylenol with booze, which is a known sort of bad interaction for everyone. I mean, it makes toxic chemicals for your liver. But so you're saying in this particular instance, they didn't run a toxicology screen. They maybe saw Kratom written on a Post-it note when they found this person, and that they're like, well, maybe Kratom was in there too, and that's in the list that the FDA is saying Kratom is associated with death.
Yeah, and I think it was actually like her husband or something.
I see it. It's on page 11.
Yeah, it was
just a report.
It was
the family member said that. Yeah, you're right. The wife.
Intentional dose. Okay, so here's the next one: a homicide with no Kratom association and a deliberate manipulation of the report. So this is the Nick Wing one. It was a gunshot wound to the chest. The FDA clearly hid the details on this death in its release of the documentation.
Maybe I'm being a broken record here, but the FDA is supposed to be protecting public health with scientifically based information. And if you go to their website, all you're seeing is bar graphs and summary statistics. You can't necessarily dig in to actually view the specifics of the report, which is why I think it probably took a journalist and some sort of Freedom of Information Act request to actually get the documents that the FDA was the primary sources that they were then translating and putting into the database. And the fact that they're like, you know what? Nah, we're not going to give it to you unless you sue us or pursue an Information Act request. FDA is supposed to work for us, the public, in the name of public safety. And the fact that they're withholding information from the public with an interest in public safety is, it's got to be illegal for government bodies to do this. And they get away with it all the time. But it's wild. Who are you really serving, right? Is it the revolving door with pharma, or are you actually trying to protect public health here?
Suicide by hanging was one of their Kratom-related deaths, with somebody with a long history of bipolar disorder, death from deep vein thrombosis and chronic polysubstance abuse, death in Germany from injuries sustained from a falling window. So this is all the stuff that's in there. It's really just on its face. It's ridiculous. I'm surprised they didn't try harder. I guess they thought nobody would really care. But they didn't count on people being interested in advocating for Kratom. The fact that they've been working for years, and you've talked about this before, they've been working for years to find a pain reliever that is a partial opioid agonist, but it doesn't recruit the beta-arrestin that causes the respiratory depression and side effects. after more than 10 years, untold hundreds of millions of dollars, granting by FDA of breakthrough status and encouraging results in phase 1 and 2 clinical trials, the final phase 3 of the clinical trial process failed to meet expectations for side effect reduction at higher doses. They were talking about, she was talking about drugs like Trevina's olicitorine. So basically what she's saying is they've been trying to find something in drug trials that does this for years and years, and now that they have something that grows on a bunch of trees in Southeast Asia, there'd be an incentive to make sure people only have access to it through a very profitable drug.
Right. Yeah, that's always it's. I forget where I've said this, but I've heard it a bunch of times. And that, like, it's not that they don't want you to use drugs; it's that they want you to use their drugs.
Yes. And their drugs won't be bad. I mean, they'll probably have some great drugs that come out of kratom alkaloids, but I think people should have access to this, and it's clearly they're making shit up to try to show how much more dangerous it is. Not that there isn't any risks for a lot of people, but it just kind of clearly, this whole thing kind of shows what they're doing.
Yeah, and so I was able to dig a little bit deeper, and I did find the specific adverse reaction that they're talking about with the metragenine. And it does say cause of death was a gunshot wound. It does include metragenine or kratom in the toxicology, or what was found in the substances, suspected ingredients and reason for use. However, it also includes benzodiazepines, alcohol, and I think other opiates besides metragenine. It's taken a minute for it to load up. But the point being, you could come to this database, so the FDA or a regulator could come to this database and say, well, they weren't saying that it was in this database. It says cause of death was a gunshot wound. In this database, they indicate that there were other compounds that were in the toxicology reports besides just kratom. So it was just a benzodiazepine and then the metragenine. Reaction was a gunshot wound and homicide. But the point being is that it seems like the FDA, in writing these reports and looking at an analysis of metragenine or kratom and then making policy recommendations, that they're like, okay, well, let's just search the database, and any case that comes that has metragenine in it, we're going to pull, and then we're going to list how many deaths had actually occurred. So it would be almost comparable to saying, let's say regulators come to you and they're like, look, we want to know if X compound is dangerous. It would be comparable to you typing in the compound in Google and then dangerous and then pressing results. It's like, 1.6 million results, must be real dangerous. It's like, what are you guys doing? You know that this doesn't make sense to just sort of insinuate or explicitly say that the kratom, because the kratom was in the toxicology report, or the family member said that they used kratom at some point, and then a death occurred down the road, you call it kratom associated deaths, you're misleading. And whether it's got to be intentional. You're intentionally misleading. It's another way you could do it is oxygen associated deaths. Well, anybody that dies on Earth is oxygen associated. So what's the point of trying to
carbon? And there was one point that she pointed out where Gottlieb, this is a quote from Gottlieb, overall, many of the cases received could not be fully assessed because of limited information provided. However, one new report of the death was of particular concern, and he indicated he was going to, and this is Babin, Dr. Gottlieb indicated the FDA was continuing to investigate that report, but ignores the fact that none of the other death reports were being investigated. So they decided they were going to investigate one where the guy might have, it might have been kratom alone, but they didn't investigate any of the other ones. And it's kind of hard to assume that they don't know what they're doing, or somebody at least that's overseeing whoever's pulling the I mean, it's really hard to assume, given the fact that there's tons of trained people within the FDA that.
And you go to the FDA and you say, look, you have some misinformation in these things. You should probably check out these entries. And like, oh well, yeah, this one. And so they'll give in and they'll say, well, look at one, but they're not going to do a thorough review of all of them, and they're going to continue to keep their position. It's another sort of political, DC dip and twirl. And it would be one thing. I mean, you couldn't publish a paper in a scientific journal without accurately like going through peer review, which is by peers that are not part of your organization, right, or not your buddies. And if they ask for the data, you generally supply that data rather quickly. And in this case, they're just not meeting that standard of like scientific work and accuracy. And they are maintaining the inaccurate position for almost a decade now. And they continue, and just most recently, like the past couple of weeks, they are using these import policy documents based on information that they have been made aware several times is inaccurate and have not fixed. So what's the deal here? Like, what's the bone to pick, and why are we continuing to do this?
And they also use those 9 Swedish deaths with the Kratom as a justification for the initial import alert.
In import alert, she calls them deceptive. I would agree, if not fraudulent, right?
Yeah.
There has to be rules on the book about government bodies like using fraudulent information to push policy decisions. But they're basing it on their sole source is primarily this database that we've been talking about at the time. And they include sentences like this: included the justification that, quote, scientific literature disclosed serious concerns regarding the toxicity of kratom in multiple organ systems. So they're putting on blinders. They're using the Google results that anytime kratom appears in the database, that must be a kratom associated death or adverse reaction. And then stating very clearly, that sentence needs to be qualified. It does not disclose serious concerns regarding the toxicity of kratom in multiple organs. You need to say, although there were several other active compounds, or on the whole, 90% of deaths that ended up reporting were polydrug users that we cannot clearly link to kratom specifically. And they don't do that.
Yeah, and another point to add is a lot of these these deaths should be investigated further by beyond just the coroner and medical examiner finding mitragynine in their system, because a lot of these medical examiners and coroners, depending on the state, don't necessarily have a lot of training, for one thing.
Yeah, that's why I brought up the specific record in that database, because cause of death is clearly listed as gunshot, but
yeah,
if they're not stating that. They're not qualifying their statements. They're saying this person died, kratom was in their system, therefore it must be kratom. And if it's not therefore, they're implicitly implying that it is. And so it's just, it's misleading. It's deceptive, for sure.
Yeah, and I'm looking at Carl Hart's new book, and I was just on the medical examiner thing with the qualifications. His appendix is death investigation systems by state, and he has qualifications. Like, for example, Colorado, to be a coroner, you get elected for a 4-year term, and the qualification is complete a basic coroner course.
Wow, and it's elected, political appointee without necessarily any scientific qualifications.
Yeah, depending on
crazy.
Yeah, Alabama, you got 12 hours of training, you're elected. Some states it's good. It's like you're appointed. You have to be a board certified forensic pathologist, but I could be a coroner in Alabama, I think.
Yeah, it's not like the government has a problem like requiring different academic or educational qualifications for any position. I mean, to run a cannabis lab in Ohio, you have to have a PhD in like chemical or biological sciences, right? So it's not like they're like, oh, well, we can't do that. We can't prescribe that. Yes, you can. You do it in other places, and you don't now.
Yeah, so I mean, even to just cite that this medical examiner determined that there was mitragynine in the blood and therefore caused death it's not enough investigation. In fact, in Colorado a few years ago, there was like 15 kratom associated deaths, quote unquote, and they actually did an investigation, and then 14 of those deaths, they said that they had poly substances, and I think most of them were fentanyl, and the other one they couldn't, didn't have access to the blood sample. So once people look more closely at this, they're not really finding evidence that kratom can kill anybody. I mean, I think there would be toxic levels of the extract,
and toxic doesn't mean death either.
Yeah,
like, so you could take a toxic level of like Coca-Cola, depending on how you define toxic. Like it can put a strain on your biological system.
Yeah.
Whether or not that causes death, I mean, I think we know, and like we mentioned earlier with the beta arrestin, opiate overdoses cause breathing, and that's why they die. Kratom does not affect the respiratory system, and its active compounds do not affect the respiratory system in a way similar to the classical opiates that are prescribed. And it's just because something binds at a receptor doesn't mean outright it is the exact same type of information. And the FDA knows this. So away from the science, real quick, I did one of the interesting twists, and this is sort of towards the bottom. It's on page 17, and they're sort of concluding about, they're wrapping things up a little bit, but the FDA puts bad information in their database. They use this bad information to suggest that there are kratom-associated deaths, and now they have the regulatory authority to impose this import alert. And when they did the import alert, they obfuscated their duty of demonstrating safety and shifted the burden to the importer. So FDA found this term in their database, and maybe it's associated with death, and FDA is supposed to be evaluating science and making policy recommendations for public health. They were like, well, we sort of see this, so now you have to prove that it's safe, not us, you do. And it's just it's why I think people can get so frustrated with politics and regulatory bodies that you just you want to bang your head against the wall, because they're just, it's hard to understand the motivation behind something like this without, that at least on paper, the mission statement of the FDA, if that's what they were actually trying to do, then why are they continuing to demonize and push for this ban?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and it just sucks when they do stuff like this, because the FDA is necessary. I mean, drugs that are prescribed should go through an approval process. And so when they do something, necessary, like the vaccine, people tend not to trust them if they're crying wolf on these other kinds of things. And it just definitely doesn't help public health to pull this kind of stuff. It's not mentally healthy, and they're creating a panic every time they do this press release and these tweets but did you see Brett Groar, the guy that he retweeted Gottlieb, and he said, you guys had terrible science, and that's why I rescinded a ban, and the FDA doesn't have the power to schedule drugs. And then Gottlieb went back at him, and he's like, you messed up a years-long investigation into it. Maybe I should read the actual tweet, but so Gottlieb characterizes it as this years-long scientific investigation that the HHS ruined by rescinding their recommendation, and this is what we're looking at. This is their big scientific investigation, sloppily entering information into their database, and then
and I think it's important to recognize, like, there's these import warnings, there's all of these sort of policy things that aren't necessarily actually law, but the FDA is continuing to recommend to the DEA that kratom become a Schedule 1 controlled substance, and that's very real. If that happens, it's going to be very bad for a lot of people who have moved on to kratom to get off more dangerous things, or using it in a safe way. And I think that's sort of what motivates a lot of us. But like, I guess it's just important to say, like, okay, there's these import warnings, there's these policy recommendations, but they are actually continuing to schedule it as Schedule 1. And if they do that, the whole industry is just going to sort of fall apart. And yeah, the notion that Scott would say, well, this was a years long investigation that was done with this most scientific rigor, like literally, it seems like someone just typed a search term in your database and then printed every report, exported it to Excel and then did count number of rows that include death. And then we're going to use that number.
Yeah. Oh, here's the tweet. We were prevented by HHS from moving forward with the scheduling of Kratom, and I'm convinced it's fueling the opioid addiction crisis. This is what he says.
Fueling. That's crazy.
And yeah, that was his big tweet. They put this out on Friday night. Gerwar, who was the HHS head who rescinded the recommendation to the DEA, said FDA doesn't schedule and only recommends. FDA's recommendation was rejected because of embarrassingly poor evidence and data and a failure to consider overall public health. If Kratom is fueling the opioid addiction, prove it. So that was cool.
Right. Do what they did, make them do their actual job. And, thank God for these other regulatory bodies that are involved in these recommendations to actually make, like, I just was real stoked to hear that when HHS, they came back and said, look, this information's horrible, we're not going to ban it. It's almost like that should be the case all the time, but it's almost a rarity, especially when you're talking about drug law and drug prohibition, that happens. And thank God for those people who are actually trying to do their job in an objective way. And I think you probably see, like, the people that are doing that are like not political appointees, have been in the FDA over a number of administrations, and aren't essentially looking for a red carpet into the board of pharmaceutical companies when they're done. It's just it's sickening how sort of corrupted almost all of our regulatory bodies have been captured by the industry they're supposed to regulate. And
absolutely, when
is it going to get fixed?
Yeah. Here's his tweet. He called it a considered multi-year scientific effort.
Yeah.
And his background is, he does have a health background. He has an MD, but he also majored in like venture capitalism or something like that. So yeah, he had his career path charted out for him.
Yeah, fueling the opiate crisis. Like, talk about drug hysteria and just sort of prohibition. Like, I don't even know how popular Kratom was in 2004, in 2003, when sort of Oxycontin hits the market and people are dropping like flies. And so if Kratom was fueling the opiate crisis, then we should continue to see rapidly increasing overdose deaths with opiate-like compounds. But we're not. And it's been coming down because there have been so much limitations placed on medical doctors on how they can even prescribe the legal opiates. And so, I'm sure anybody that had a prescription for these things, like, understands what the doctors go through, what the patients go through, the sort of shame associated with the whole thing. But that did bring the deaths and overdose deaths down. Yet they're still trying to say that the opiate crisis is being fueled by something that is essentially the off ramp. It's tragic, and it's just not surprising. And I wish it wasn't that way.
Yeah, and I mean, if it becomes an illegal substance, and then it's wide open for more adulteration that we have seen. I mean, because you hear about people snorting cocaine laced with fentanyl, and it's not good for the public health to outlaw substances. It's good to regulate them.
And it's not good for public health to lie or mislead people on what is dangerous and what actually isn't dangerous. Like, we always talk about that in relative to cannabis. Opiates are addictive and dangerous and can kill you. Alcohol is dangerous and can kill you, and withdrawal from alcohol can kill you. If we want effective drug policy and we actually want to protect public health, being honest about what isn't and what is dangerous is critical to that mission.
Thank you, Dr. John Cachat. Check him out on social media at jcachat. And please read this document. We'll have a link to the PDF file in the description. It's Jane Babin's FDA Fails to Follow the Science on Kratom. The music is Captain Big Wheel. The Kratom Science Journal Club is produced by me, Brian Gallagher, for KratomScience.com. Take care.